Prince Edward walked into the briefing room expecting numbers, balance sheets, and the quiet rustle of administrative files. He expected a routine meeting with the family trustees, the kind of corporate formality that fills the calendar of a working royal. But the moment the heavy doors closed, the atmosphere turned cold. The senior trustee did not open a standard financial ledger. Instead, he broke the wax seal on a document that had remained untouched for decades. One sentence echoed through the room, shattering the polished silence of the palace. Prince Edward had just inherited Princess Diana's most secret, most protected palace role. This was not a symbolic honor, not a title meant for the papers, and certainly not a role King Charles could overrule. It was a hidden mechanism of private authority, built on memory, loyalty, and sheer institutional leverage. Before we expose the explosive details of what this inheritance contains, and why it has triggered an immediate crisis behind palace doors, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an exclusive update. The quietest brother sat completely motionless, his hands resting flat on the mahogany table as the reality of the situation began to settle into the room. Edward did not reach for the folder right away. He simply stared at the faces of the three senior trustees, his mind racing to process a structural shift that no one in the modern household had ever hinted at. The briefing had been quietly logged on his public schedule as a standard, routine review of legacy duties linked to family trusts and historical assets. A trustee's briefing is supposed to be a private, legally protected meeting where appointed guardians disclose instructions regarding sensitive family funds or specific historical mandates. Edward expected signatures. He expected to nod through a few pages of legal jargon regarding real estate or centuries-old charity funds. He did not expect Diana's ghost to suddenly reach across the decades and completely rewrite the hierarchy of the royal household. The senior trustee turned the page of the document, explaining that this specific role had been locked away in a secure legal vault because it originated entirely from Diana's private, uncodified influence inside the palace walls during the height of her conflict with the institution. This was completely separate from an ordinary patronage, which is just the public support a royal gives to a charity for a good public relations headline. This was a private custodial shield, a hidden network designed to protect vulnerable household staff, look after young royals in times of severe emotional crisis, and keep sensitive family matters entirely out of the hands of palace politicians and ambitious courtiers. The weight of the room shifted instantly as the realization hit everyone present. Edward, who had spent his entire life avoiding the sharpest battles of the monarchy, was suddenly holding the keys to Diana's unfinished moral authority. The news traveled through the palace corridors like a quiet shockwave, hitting the king's desk before the trustees had even packed up their briefcases. When Charles read the emergency executive summary forwarded by his personal private secretary, his face hardened into a mask of pure disbelief. The king understood the immediate threat this posed to the centralized control of his reign. The trustees had confirmed the transfer of this specific authority without seeking the sovereign's final approval, proving that some elements of Diana's legacy were structurally built to survive any attempt to force them into the standard palace order. Edward felt the pressure mounting on his shoulders. He knew this was not a reward for his years of quiet, drama-free service to the firm. It was a calculated test of loyalty. The trustee then revealed the exact clause that made the inheritance so incredibly dangerous for the modern setup. Diana had explicitly mandated that this protection network must never fall into the hands of anyone who might use it for public relations, personal image building, or political leverage over other family members. A handwritten instruction, preserved alongside the legacy files, named Edward as the one royal whose lack of ruthless ambition made him the only safe choice to hold the keys. That revelation didn't just sideline the king. It sent an icy signal straight to the Queen Consort's office. Camilla's name had been completely and explicitly excluded from the chain of oversight. Not delayed for a future review, not left open for discussion among the senior royals, but permanently and legally excluded. Once Edward realized the sheer scale of the files now under his control, the household had to confront a much darker question. Who exactly had Diana been trying to keep away from these documents, and what secrets were they trying to unearth from the archives? The fallout touched every single corner of the family within hours. Edward stood at the center of the storm, entirely stunned by a duty he had never sought and never envisioned for himself. Charles saw the move as a direct challenge to the absolute control of his reign, an unwanted reminder that the past could still dictate the terms of the present. Camilla sensed an invisible barrier rising before her staff could even investigate the true scope of the files. William watched the developing situation with absolute intensity from his own office, knowing that his mother's name still possessed the unique power to reorder the entire monarchy without moving a single crown or altering an official state document. Edward had never modeled his royal life around the pursuit of command or public adoration. He had always chosen to exist beside the louder, more dominant forces of the family, close enough to understand the crushing weight of the institution, yet far enough from the front lines to avoid the scars of their public warfare. Charles carried the heavy burden of the throne and the constant struggle for modern relevance. William carried the future of the line and the modern image of a changing monarchy, and carried the steel of daily duty and relentless public engagements. Edward carried something far quieter, a steady, unyielding discipline that rarely made the front pages. And that was precisely why the trustees' decision carried such devastating force. A palace protection network meant a private system of checks and balances inside royal life, created specifically to shield ordinary people from institutional pressure, forced silence, and corporate control. It was never intended for the cameras or the glittering galas. It was designed for the moments when the palace's pristine surface hid deep, systemic pain underneath the polished floors. Edward remained seated long after the briefing concluded, tracing his finger along the edge of the leather folder, wondering why this explosive legacy had landed squarely in his lap. He knew exactly what made it dangerous. This wasn't a medal to wear at a military parade. It was a moral boundary line, drawn by Diana when she realized that human compassion needed protection from absolute power. To understand why this hidden role had been locked away with such fierce legal security, you have to look back at the exact moment that made its creation necessary in the first place. Years before Edward's name was placed on that document, a single private incident changed the way Diana viewed the entire palace machine. It wasn't a headline scandal that the tabloids picked up, or a public falling out on the palace balcony. It was a closed-door confrontation that took place immediately after a crowded palace charity reception, where Diana discovered that a young, vulnerable staff member had been systematically pressured into absolute silence by senior courtiers after witnessing a major protocol breach. That specific night became the turning point for her. Diana understood the reality of fear when it was dressed up as institutional obedience because she had lived it herself. She had experienced firsthand how palace life could force people to lower their voices, internalize their pain, and accept unfair treatment simply because the system looked too massive to challenge. Her private network began quietly, serving as an informal, safe channel for household employees who felt crushed by the rigid hierarchy or abandoned by the very institution that demanded their total, unquestioning loyalty. The palace is not just a historic home for a famous family. It is a corporate machine, and machines are built to protect themselves at all costs, unless someone actively forces them to protect the people inside. That intervention became critical following the Kensington charity reception. After the guests had departed and the cameras were turned off, Diana found out that a junior aide had been given strict orders never to speak about severe mistreatment by a high-ranking household figure. Kensington, a residence deeply tied to the private, messy realities of family history, became the setting where an invisible boundary was crossed. A public event meant to celebrate kindness and charity had left an ordinary worker completely defenseless in the shadows of the royal estate. Diana refused to let the hypocrisy stand under her roof. She confronted the senior courtier in a private office, removed her gloves, placed them deliberately on the table, and stated clearly that the monarchy would not survive if it prioritized protecting institutional power over human dignity. Edward had seen her immediately after that meeting. He was much younger then, a quiet observer in the family structure who mostly stayed out of the way. He passed her in the corridor and never forgot the look in her eyes. It wasn't panic or anger. It was absolute, unshakable resolve. She had survived the system, and she was going to make sure others had a shield, which is exactly why she drafted the secret charter that the trustees just handed over. The secret charter that the trustees just handed over was not a document designed to gather dust, and as Edward began to read the secondary clauses, the true scale of his political isolation inside the modern household became terrifyingly clear. He realized that this old instruction was the trustees' ultimate defense when the inevitable confrontation with Camilla finally took place behind closed doors. The moment the Queen Consort realized this role carried actual, unappealable authority over specific internal sectors, the quiet inheritance transformed into a direct battle of wills that no one in the palace could ignore. The emergency meeting took place in a secure room on the ground floor, but the emotional tension vibrated through the entire building like a low-frequency hum. Camilla entered the space believing this was simply another minor administrative detail that could be managed, redirected, or absorbed into the standard household routine by a few clever memos from her press team. Edward stood beside the trustees, visibly uncomfortable with the brewing confrontation but completely unyielding in his posture. Charles watched silently from the head of the table, his arms crossed, caught between his loyalty to his wife and the terrifying legal precision of his late wife's estate planning. Camilla asked the one question that defined the entire conflict, demanding to know if Edward now held unilateral authority over the legacy files and the internal welfare assignments. She wanted structural clarity, but everyone in the room knew she was testing the limits of her own control over the domestic staff. The meeting had been called specifically to draw a hard line between what Edward's inherited role allowed him to protect and what remained completely outside the reach of the Queen Consort's office. A trustee is a person legally bound to protect an instruction on behalf of another, and in this instance, the three men in gray suits were guarding Diana's original intent from contemporary palace pressure with a level of ferocity that shocked the reigning monarch. This mattered immensely because the files contained sensitive staff protections, historic non-disclosure agreements that Diana had bypassed, and private household notes that could shatter internal trust if mishandled by contemporary public relations managers. Edward weighed every single syllable before he spoke, knowing that a single misstep would ignite a civil war within the family. He had not sought this conflict, but he knew that the palace would instantly interpret silence as submission, and he had promised himself he would not disgrace the trust placed in him. The senior trustee intervened before Camilla could press further, clarifying that Diana's original mandate gave the guardian the explicit right to protect specific welfare files from external review, even from individuals who sat at the very top of the royal household hierarchy. Camilla leaned forward, her expression tightening as she asked directly if her position as queen granted her the right of executive review over these specific archives. The trustee did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He simply said no. It was a single devastating word that settled the matter instantly and left a ringing silence in the room. Charles looked toward his brother with a heavy, painful expression that he could not entirely hide from the staff standing near the door. The king wasn't just watching a bureaucratic door close in his wife's face. He was watching his younger brother hold a protected responsibility, linked directly to Diana that the crown itself could not command or manipulate. That was the deepest wound of the afternoon. Charles had spent decades managing the complex shadow of Diana's memory, trying to balance history with the realities of his modern reign. Now that shadow had taken the form of a legal document held by Edward, a brother who had always been content to stay in the background. Edward looked directly across the table, meeting Camilla's gaze, and stated that while he didn't ask for the burden, he would not violate Diana's explicit instructions just to avoid discomfort within the family circle. The words changed him in that very moment. He was no longer just the stunned brother who handled the family's minor public events. He was the guardian of a hidden history. The trustees then read the final, defining clause of the secondary packet, confirming that the original framework explicitly blocked the spouses of reigning monarchs from overriding the guardian's decisions regarding staff sanctuary. Camilla did not argue further, realizing that throwing a tantrum in front of senior legal trustees would only broadcast her lack of leverage. She became entirely still, a calculating silence that worried the veteran staff far more than an outburst of anger would have. Behind that corporate surface lay a legal machinery that had been waiting for this exact alignment of events for over 30 years. The monarchy operates on public ceremonies, state dinners, and official signatures, but its most critical shifts often happen in silent rooms where there is no audience to applaud or judge. The trustees simply relied on the letter of the law, proving that Diana had made this role emotionally and legally impossible to alter without causing a massive public scandal that the current administration could not afford. Edward walked away from the meeting realizing this was an intense, crushing burden wrapped in absolute trust. The authority came from a private legacy structure, a legally insulated arrangement designed to preserve her instructions long after she was gone from the physical palace. Edward returned to his private quarters that evening and confessed to Sophie that he felt entirely unequal to the task before him. His admission wasn't a theatrical display or a bid for sympathy. It was the honest anxiety of a man who genuinely didn't want to use his sister-in-law's painful memory as a weapon against his own brother. Sophie listened quietly, pouring a cup of tea, before giving him the exact perspective he needed to survive the coming weeks. She told him that his profound reluctance was precisely why Diana's trust had chosen him in the first place. Ambition would have seized the opportunity to blackmail the throne. Edward wanted to protect the people behind the files, and that made all the difference. Charles spent the evening in his private study processing a difficult, bitter truth that cut deeper than any modern press criticism ever could. The king had to accept that Diana's final legal structures placed far more faith in his younger brother's restraint than in the authority of the throne itself. He possessed the crown, the palaces, the infinite resources of the state machinery, and yet this one continuous piece of the past remained completely out of his reach, answering to a different moral code. Power had lost the room. Trust had won it. The trustees had finalized the briefing by reading the operational clause that changed the daily rules of the household staff. Edward's role included the explicit power to deny access requests from senior figures, if those requests compromised the independence of the welfare files. In plain terms, access meant the authorization to review protected data that held the secrets of past palace conflicts, and the names of those who had sought help from Diana when the official system turned its back on them. The trustee read the final line of the charter with deliberate emphasis, noting that the guardian must protect the vulnerable even when the threat originates from within the family itself. The room went entirely cold as those words echoed in the silence. Sophie understood the immediate, dangerous implications of that sentence before anyone else in the household could process it. Camilla's staff had already submitted an official, written request to review one of those exact legacy files earlier that week, under the guise of updating the household employment archives. The moment that request was formally denied by Edward's office, the palace entered a silence so deep that even the king's personal intervention couldn't soften the impact. The first real consequence wasn't a public argument or a leaked story to the Sunday papers. It was a simple bureaucratic rejection handled by a low-level clerk. A senior palace aide walked toward the archive office expecting a routine pickup of the files, only to be turned away under the direct authority of Prince Edward's newly activated office. That single interaction made the hidden power shift fully visible to the entire royal court. Camilla was no longer just dealing with an old document from the 90s. She was facing a hard, contemporary boundary line, managed by a member of the immediate family. Edward handled the denial with a quiet, surprising confidence that left the veteran courtiers scratching their heads in disbelief. His first official act as guardian proved to everyone in the household that the role had teeth, and wasn't just a sentimental tribute to the past. It was an active gatekeeper that could say no to the highest offices in the land without fearing administrative retaliation. Camilla received the confirmation note of the denial in total silence while sitting in her private drawing room. She folded the paper once, setting it down by her untouched tea, and stared out the window into the courtyard. She didn't shout or demand that the clerk be fired, because she knew that public anger would only highlight the limitation of her reach and validate the trustees' legal standing. Instead, she maintained an icy composure that signaled a deeper, more calculated approach to the problem. Charles attempted to ease the tension later that evening, suggesting the matter could be reviewed or clarified during a quiet dinner, but his words lacked real weight and everyone knew it. The king knew the boundary was legally binding under the unique terms of the royal trust laws. He could comfort his wife all he wanted, but he could not open the locked door without Edward's express permission, and Edward was already consulting with a different faction of the family. From a distance, William quietly signaled his support for the newly established boundary, ensuring his position was felt without creating unnecessary noise. He didn't make a public scene, nor did he turn family history into a media event for the midday news cycle. Instead, the prince sent a direct, private message to Edward's secure network, stating clearly that their mother's safeguards must remain completely intact, regardless of the administrative friction it caused in the main wing of the palace. The message gave Edward the validation he needed to stand his ground, but it also solidified the heavy, isolating responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. Sophie watched him later that evening as he stood silently near the secure archive cabinet in his private study, realizing the duty was already shifting his fundamental position within the family dynamic. He was no longer just the quiet, reliable brother who kept his head down and avoided trouble. He was actively guarding the integrity of a painful memory against intense, contemporary institutional pressure. When Edward arranged to meet William privately the following afternoon, ensuring no personal aides or veteran courtiers were present to take notes, the internal dynamic shifted entirely, leaving the king's primary office completely outside the loop. Behind those closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the household staff, the conversation moved entirely away from legalities and turned into a deeply personal exchange between two men who understood the human cost of the monarchy better than anyone else. William entered the room prepared to protect his mother's legacy from being used as a palace chess piece or a tool for temporary political leverage. Edward entered with the profound humility of a man still processing a major institutional shock. William didn't come to dispute the appointment or question the trustees' judgment. He came to see if his uncle genuinely understood the soul of the responsibility he had just inherited. He needed to know if Edward would treat the role as a living, breathing duty to the vulnerable or just another historic title to be archived away in the royal library. Diana wasn't a historical concept or a media talking point to William. She was his mother, and any sudden mention of her name or her private files brought back a lifetime of private grief that had never truly left him. Edward acknowledged that reality immediately, choosing to speak with absolute honesty, rather than hiding behind royal protocols. He knew the trustees had given him the legal framework, but he recognized that William's personal loss gave him a higher moral claim than any document could provide. Edward didn't hide behind the language of the charter, or try to minimize the tension. He listened patiently as William explained what the protection network meant to the people who had originally relied on it during the turbulent years of the 90s. When William placed an old family photograph on the table between them, the entire tone of the meeting shifted from a formal briefing to a shared commitment. The prince explained that his mother believed true protection required taking real risks, not just issuing kind words in public statements. It wasn't enough to remember her warmth or praise her charitable works. Someone had to stand at the gate and defend the boundaries she left behind when the system tried to erase them. Edward admitted his fear of handling the responsibility poorly, confessing that the scale of the hidden archive weighed heavily on his mind, and that vulnerability established an immediate bond of trust between them. William's cautious stance softened instantly. Fear meant Edward understood the true gravity of the files he was holding. He wasn't looking for influence or trying to build a rival faction within the household. He was humbled by the burden. For the first time since the trustees broke the seal, the inheritance felt less like an institutional crisis and more like a shared promise between generations. William then shared a specific memory that completely changed Edward's expression, revealing that Diana had once spoken highly of Edward's quiet decency during a private conversation following the Kensington incident. She had described him in a private conversation as one of the few people in the building who genuinely listened without trying to control the narrative or use the information for personal gain. Edward had never known those words existed, and hearing them voiced by her son decades later brought an immediate clarity to his task. He quietly promised his nephew that the archive would remain completely insulated from anyone looking for political leverage or administrative control. The agreement created a unified front that the king and queen consort had not anticipated, signaling that the younger generation and the quietest brother were now aligned on the future of the private estate. By the following morning, the emotional reality of the situation could no longer be kept behind palace walls, as staff members began to realize that a major shift in internal authority had taken place. The public didn't know the specific legal codes or the contents of the locked files, but the narrative resonance was immediate when the palace released a highly controlled, concise statement confirming Edward's new custodial responsibility over a legacy trust. Custodial responsibility in this setting meant being legally responsible for protecting a sensitive duty, rather than just acting as a public representative for a photo opportunity. The language of the press release was carefully chosen to avoid any hint of internal conflict, but the public and the media commentators immediately read between the lines. Diana's most protected work had completely bypassed the throne and landed with Edward, sparking intense speculation about the true state of relationships behind the scenes. The media response was instantaneous and overwhelming. A major London daily featured a prominent front-page layout showing the quiet prince alongside an archival photograph of Diana, with a headline that read, "Diana's trespasses to Edward." The phrase turned a private legal briefing into a national conversation within hours, tapping into the public's enduring fascination with her legacy. The public didn't need a detailed legal breakdown to understand the symbolism of the choice. They saw the quietest member of the family selected to hold a line that absolute power couldn't move, and the emotional response from the public was deeply felt. Outside Kensington Palace, a small group of people gathered quietly throughout the afternoon, leaving simple bouquets of white flowers and handwritten notes thanking Diana for still finding ways to protect the vulnerable through her chosen family members. Kensington remained deeply tied to her history, a place where her private struggles and her public warmth still felt incredibly present to the ordinary people who remembered her work. The handwritten notes left by the public carried a powerful, undeniable message. People believed her core values had survived the rigid machinery of the state, and that Edward had been given a serious promise to keep for the future. Charles monitored the press coverage in absolute silence from his study, feeling the undeniable sting of the narrative as it unfolded on the morning broadcasts. The public focus was entirely fixed on Diana and Edward, completely overshadowing the current routine of his reign and his planned public appearances for the week. A veteran broadcaster noted during a live segment that the quietest royal had just become the guardian of the loudest unfinished legacy, a description that resonated because of its accuracy. William understood the reality of the situation, Edward respected the weight of the public expectation, and Charles had to endure the uncomfortable focus on the past. Camilla's total absence from the media narrative became a story in itself. As commentators noted, she did not issue a statement or attempt to reframe the focus of the trust. She did not appear before the cameras to project an image of family unity or comment on the administrative changes, and her absolute silence highlighted the reality of the boundary the trustees had drawn around the archive. The ultimate meaning of the inheritance didn't belong to the headlines, the court commentators, or the crowds gathering outside the gates. It belonged entirely to the choice Edward made in the quiet hours that followed the storm, when the paperwork was finalized and the legal realities took effect. In the end, the responsibility didn't make him loud, confrontational, or eager to challenge the authority of the throne. It made his purpose entirely clear to everyone who worked within the household. He didn't use the hidden role to seek personal leverage, create a public spectacle, or claim an internal victory over his relatives during a difficult time for the family. He did something far more permanent and far more respectful of the trust he had been given. He protected it with every resource at his disposal. In an institution where every genuine emotion is routinely converted into formal protocol and public relations management, Edward chose absolute restraint,